Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a question that I think puzzles a lot of us when we see it.
Mm.
You know, you watch those videos of big wave surfers on these absolute mountains of water.
Or high-altitude climbers making these split-second life or death choices.
Exactly. And you just have to ask, what is truly motivating someone to take on that level of extreme, life-threatening risk? The easy answer is always, oh, they're adrenaline junkies.
Right.
But our deep dive today suggests something, well, something far more intricate. And frankly, maybe a little darker.
It is a profoundly compelling question. And that's because the motivation we see right on the surface, that thrill-seeking, is often just the behavioral tip of the iceberg.
The end result of something else.
Precisely. When we start to synthesize the psychology, the neurobiology, and really the life histories of these individuals, we find that the drive isn't always about, adding excitement to life. Sometimes it's a desperate attempt to regulate an internal system that has been, for lack of a better word, fundamentally broken.
Exactly. So today we're going to explore this really surprising convergence of psychology, sports science, and hard neurobiology. We're going to make the case that for a pretty significant group of people, these extreme sports, they're not just a hobby.
No.
They are a powerful, biologically driven coping mechanism. And this mechanism is rooted in very specific neurological patterns that, and this might be the surprising part, trace all the way back to past experiences of chronic stress or trauma.
Our mission here is to trace that entire pathway for you. We want to go from the internal psychological burden, step by step, all the way to the external high-risk behavior.
And by the end of this, you will learn why certain early life experiences, things involving unpredictability or threat, can quite literally rewire your body's entire stress response.
And then we'll explore how that state of internal chaos, of dysregulation, how that manifests as this intense, sometimes even addictive, search for mastery and control.
A search for sensation in the outside world to quiet the noise inside.
Exactly. So if you, or maybe someone you know, seems to be constantly drawn to the edge just to feel centered, this dive is going to offer some really profound clarity.
So to really understand why someone might choose to, climb a rock face with no ropes, we have to start at the absolute foundation. We have to talk about the body's response to stress.
And not just any stress.
No, not the stress of a deadline. We are talking about chronic stress, particularly events that happen early in life, what researchers call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
And the critical thing to understand is that these events, they don't just leave emotional scars, they cause profound, observable physical changes. There's a term for it, biological embedding.
Biological embedding, it's such a powerful idea. It forces you to recognize that trauma and chronic stress, they aren't just abstract misfortunes, right?
No. They're concrete physiological events. I mean, they permanently recalibrate your stress systems. It's like setting your internal operating system to a very dangerous default setting.
And the best way to sort of quantify that, to measure the cost of that exposure, is something called the allostatic load model, the ALM.
Yes, and we should probably spend a minute on that because this model is really where the groundwork for all that future risk-taking is laid.
Okay, so let's break it down. How does this system, which is supposed to help us adapt, turn into this huge vulnerability?
Well, it all starts with a process called allostase. And allostase is magnificent. It's absolutely essential. It's your body's ability to maintain internal stability, what we call homeostasis, by actively adjusting to short-term stress.
So like you step off a curb, a car almost hits you, your heart pounds, you jump back. That's allostase.
That's a perfect example. Your body floods with hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, your heart rate spikes. You're ready for fight or flight. And then once the threat is gone, the system is supposed to recover, it comes back down to baseline. That whole process, maintaining stability through change, that is allostase.
Okay, so that's the system working perfectly. It handles the threat and then resets.
Exactly. But the allostatic load model, it describes what happens when that system is chronically, constantly overworked. When the stress isn't just one car, one near miss.
It's daily. It's pervasive.
It's for months or even years, like living with persistent instability or emotional threat. When that happens, the body starts to accrue what we call the allostatic load.
And that's basically the cumulative cost.
It is the cumulative biological cost of all that long-term stress.
Right.
Your body has these buffers, physiological resources, neurochemical capacity, but they're not infinite. They get used up.
So it's like you're constantly taking out these small loans against your nervous system's capacity, and the debt just keeps piling up.
That's a great analogy. And the wear and tear is immense. It's the price you pay for constantly adapting. It's the oversecretion of stress hormones like cortisol, which we now know damages neurons in the hippocampus, a part of the brain crucial for memory and mood.
And I imagine it affects more than just the brain.
Oh, absolutely. It's increased blood pressure, it's chronic muscle tension, it's a dysregulated autonomic nervous system. And when those stressors, the ACEs, the life events, when they keep exceeding your body's now diminished resources, especially if you don't have good coping skills or a support system,
You hit a tipping point.
you enter allostatic overload. And overload is the system failure point. Precisely. The systems stop being adaptive. Instead of helping you recover, they start causing the damage themselves. They become pathological.
This is what people mean by toxic stress, isn't it?
That is the definition of toxic stress. Being exposed to high, prolonged stressors with little to no internal or external support. Your defense systems get stuck. They're either stuck on high alert, creating this state of perpetual anxiety and vigilance, or
Or they just burn out.
they burn out completely, they become exhausted, numb, and that creates apathy, emotional flatness. Both of those states, the hyper-aroused and the hypo-aroused, are states of profound dysregulation. They leave you deeply vulnerable.
Okay, so let's follow that fallout. Once you're in that state of overload, what's happening at the neurobiological level? You mentioned the stress processing systems, the HPA axis.
Yes, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, and the sympathobrenal medullary, or SAM system.
Yeah.
Toxic stress fundamentally changes how they operate.
And these changes, they have a ripple effect through the whole central nervous system.
A massive ripple effect. Let's take the HPA axis. In a healthy person, it works on a really delicate feedback loop. Cortisol spikes under stress, and then receptors in your brain, they basically tell the axis, okay, enough, shut down production.
It's self-regulating.
It's supposed to be. But under chronic stress, that negative feedback loop gets damaged. It gets blunted. So you start to see these really dysfunctional patterns of cortisol. Either it's chronically high all the time, or paradoxically, it can be chronically low because the receptors have just given up. They're desensitized.
The system's either flooded or it's empty. Either way, it's broken.
And that failure to regulate cortisol is one of the clearest signature marks of this biological embedding we're talking about.
So what's the invisible cost of all that?
Yeah.
All that cellular stress, what does it produce?
One of the most critical results, and one we often overlook, is low-grade chronic inflammation. Some people call it silent inflammation.
Right.
When your body is under constant pressure, your metabolic demands just skyrocket. That high energy consumption leads to an increase in what we call oxidative stress, basically an excess of reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
And ROS, they're like cellular exhaust, right? They're waste products that damage tissue, like rust on metal.
That is a perfect analogy. They are highly reactive molecules, and these neuroinflammatory processes, they do direct damage to the central nervous system. They can compromise the blood-brain barrier, and most importantly, they target your delicate neuronal networks.
And the damage, the inflammation, that's what starts to mess with your brain chemistry, your neurotransmitters.
Yes. Because chronic inflammation actually diverts the resources your brain needs to function properly. It directly reduces the availability of key neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers for your mood, your focus, your sense of reward.
Which ones are hit the hardest?
The big ones are dopamine, or DA, and serotonin, 5-HT. Especially in the brain's reward system, the mesolimbic pathway, inflammation just messes with the whole assembly line. The synthesis, the transport, the utilization of these chemicals.
So now we have a brain that's inflamed and starved of its own reward chemicals. What does that do to the actual structure of the brain? Where does the wiring, start to fray?
The fraying is most visible in two absolutely critical areas.
Yeah.
Prefrontal cortex, the PFC, and the amygdala.
The PFC is the CEO of the brain, right?
Right.
Planning and impulse control.
Exactly. Executive functions, decision-making, emotional regulation. Under chronic stress, the PFC can literally shrink. It becomes functionally compromised. And at the exact same time, the amygdala,
The brain's alarm system.
the alarm system, which processes threat and fear, it becomes hyper-responsive, overly sensitive. Sometimes it just starts firing indiscriminately.
Wow. So you end up with an individual who has a weakened ability to think clearly and control their impulses, paired with this incredibly loud, overactive internal alarm bell. I mean, that sounds like the very definition of vulnerability.
It is the neurobiological definition of vulnerability, and that state is linked directly to a much higher risk for a whole host of mental disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, PTSD, even chronic fatigue syndrome, and tragically, a significant increase in suicidality.
And it's not just mental.
Not at all. This is the mechanism that links stress to somatic to bodily illnesses. The same inflammation that's driving those brain changes is what increases your risk for cardiovascular disease, for type 2 diabetes, even for cancer. The psychological burden is definitively physically real.
Okay, so we've established that this chronic stress literally alters the nervous system, chemically and structurally. It leaves a person in this constant state of internal dysregulation.
Yeah.
A background hum of unease or maybe just numbness.
Yes.
So now let's move to the psychological response. How does a person adapt to living inside a system that is constantly out of balance?
This is where we pivot a little bit from the hard neurobiology to evolutionary psychology, which really looks at human behavior as a series of strategic adaptations to our early life environments.
Okay.
The core question becomes, how does an organism maximize its chances of survival based on the world it perceived as a child? And for that, we look at things like life history theory, or LHT, and the adaptive calibration model.
Life history theory.
Yeah.
So the idea is that our early environment kind of calibrates our life strategy.
That's the essence of it. LHT suggests that if you grow up in an environment that feels stable, safe, resource-rich, an environment where long-term planning actually works.
Then your system favors what they call a slow life strategy.
Exactly. That means delayed gratification, lower impulsivity, and investing in stable long-term things like relationships and career because you expect a future payoff.
That makes perfect sense. If the world is predictable, you invest in the long term. But what if it's not?
Well, conversely, if you're embedded in an environment that's unpredictable, maybe hostile or resource scarce, a high-stress childhood, the system calibrates toward a fast life strategy.
Okay, and what does that look like?
It prioritizes immediate rewards, higher impulsivity, getting resources now because the future feels incredibly uncertain or even dangerous. And crucially, from a biological standpoint, the nervous system in this strategy tends to operate with lower baseline cortisol and much higher impulsivity.
So the brain is essentially making a rational bet based on the early data it got. It's saying, look, the world is chaotic, so long-term planning is a sucker's game. I need high-stakes, quick wins to survive.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And the adaptive calibration model supports this. It suggests that for people who grew up in these difficult environments, taking more risks isn't just reckless. It's seen as an adaptive survival mechanism.
Because the potential reward from a big risk might outweigh the certain misery of just staying put.
Precisely. In an unstable world, risk might be the only path to a greater reward. So extreme risk-taking becomes an external expression of this fast life calibration. It's a way to get rapid social recognition or resources or, and this is key, intense physiological arousal.
The intensity of the environment dictates the intensity of the behavior you need to feel normal in it.
To feel regulated, yes.
Yeah.
They take risks to jack up their own arousal level, which helps them feel alive, focused, or just, for a moment, in control.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because those characteristics of the fast life strategy, the impulsivity, the restlessness, the need for high arousal, that leads us directly to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. It's often said that trauma can wear the mask of ADHD.
The link between trauma and ADHD is one of the most significant findings in this whole area. They are so intricately connected. If you look at trauma-related disorders like PTSD and a neurodevelopmental disorder like ADHD, the symptom overlap is just massive.
What kind of symptoms are we talking about?
Inattention, disorganization, chronic restlessness, emotional dysregulation, anxiety, and, of course, profound risk-taking behavior. If you put the diagnostic criteria side by side, the similarities are just striking.
So for a traumatized person, those symptoms are basically the outward sign of a nervous system that's stuck in, what, hyperarousal or hypoarousal?
Exactly. So it's not just that they look similar behaviorally. It's often a case of one actually inducing the other.
That's the key takeaway, isn't it? The relationship is bidirectional.
It is. It's bidirectional and it's reinforcing. Research consistently shows that childhood maltreatment and chronic stress significantly increase the risk for a later ADHD diagnosis. We're talking about studies that show a 2 to 5 times higher probability.
So the trauma itself can create the neurobiological conditions, the dysregulated HPA axis, the inflammation, that then present as ADHD symptoms.
That appears to be the case. The root cause is the environmental stress. But the presentation is this behavioral dysregulation, and then it reinforces itself.
How so?
Because an individual who already has genuine neurodevelopmental ADHD is, by nature, more impulsive. Their risk-taking tendencies make them more accident-prone. So they are more likely to experience subsequent accidents and physical traumas, which then increases their risk for developing PTSD.
So it just becomes this spiraling cycle of biological disruption, behavioral risk, and ever-increasing vulnerability.
A vicious cycle. And of course, we should be clear, we're not saying everyone with ADHD has experienced trauma or that
Yeah.
all trauma leads to ADHD, but that the two conditions share these deeply entwined mechanisms around arousal and regulation.
Right. And to really get why these high arousal activities become so mandatory for these individuals, we have to zoom in on the core neurochemical driver, which is dopamine.
Reduced dopamine signaling, yes. It's central to ADHD, and as we already discussed, chronic stress and inflammation tank your availability of dopamine, especially in the brain's pleasure and motivation circuits.
So if your baseline level of dopamine, that main chemical for drive and reward, is chronically low, what does that actually feel like for a person? What is reward deficiency syndrome?
It's often misunderstood as just being bored, but it's so much deeper than that. The reward deficiency syndrome, or RDS, is a constant, low-grade state of understimulation. It's a kind of anhedonia, a restlessness.
So normal, everyday things just don't register.
They don't land. The brain isn't just bored, it is actively failing to process normal rewards, like a sense of accomplishment or a stable relationship or moderate pleasure. The system is just constantly starved for stimulation because the baseline is too low to feel functional or alert or even just normal.
And the brain will not tolerate that state for long. It's going to find a solution.
It absolutely will. To compensate for that internal deficit, to force an activation of the reward center, individuals become powerfully driven toward behaviors or substances that can create a massive short-term surge of dopamine.
And that's the mechanism behind addiction.
It underlies drug and alcohol addiction, compulsive gambling, and, critically for our conversation, the pursuit of extremely intense, high-stakes activities.
So what's the difference between a normal dopamine spike and the kind of spike they're chasing in these extreme sports?
Well, a normal activity, maybe a good meal or finishing a project, might give you a small, satisfying rise in dopamine, enough to feel good and stay motivated. An extreme sport, on the other hand, activates the sympathetic nervous system violently. The sheer intensity of the threat, the immediate proximity of catastrophic failure or death causes this massive compensatory neurochemical cascade.
And that surge is powerful enough to finally break through that feeling of numbness.
It overwhelms the deficit. And it brings the individual, even if it's just for a brief time, back to a baseline of intense, focused, and rewarding attention. Ultra-endurance sports, high-risk sports. They provide a potent and often a socially acceptable short-term fix for that dopamine-starved brain.
But the fix is always temporary. The underlying problem, the inflammation, the dysregulated HPA axis, it's all still there. So the surge fades and they have to go chase it again.
Precisely. They are, in a very real sense, self-medicating their own neurology. The effect wears off, the restlessness returns, and soon they require a greater or more immediate stimulus to get that same feeling of being okay. And that leads, inevitably, to ever-increasing exposure to risk.
Which brings us to the behavior itself, the deliberate pursuit of these extreme sports. We're talking free solo climbing, big wave surfing, wingsuit flying, activities with a real high risk of injury or death.
And we have to acknowledge the statistics here. This isn't theoretical risk. Participation in these activities carries real lethality. Flying sports especially, like base jumping and wingsuit flying, have documented incredibly high rates of severe injury, including frequent loss of consciousness. The risks are known, and yet the compulsion remains.
Which tells us it's far too simplistic to just say they're chasing a feeling. There seems to be a deeper motive here, especially for those with trauma histories. And that is this profound need for psychological control.
Yes, the core of this motivation really is about reversing past helplessness. Trauma, especially early trauma, is defined by a complete loss of control over your own safety, your own environment.
You are passive. Things are happening to you.
Exactly. So participating in an activity that demands intense focus, meticulous preparation, and absolute mastery, that offers a way to actively reconstruct that sense of agency that was once so violently threatened. The extreme environment becomes a crucible where you can prove your competence.
Okay, but let me challenge that for a second. How does a perfectly planned, self-imposed risk truly resolve a trauma that was rooted in chaos you couldn't control? Isn't it just a very high-stakes form of distraction?
That's a critical question, and I would argue it moves beyond just distraction because the process involves such active competence. In the original trauma, the person feels passive, like a victim. In extreme sports, the athlete is entirely the agent.
They're in charge.
Completely. They meticulously analyze the conditions, they calculate every variable, they execute with flawless precision. And successfully mastering a scenario where the consequences of a mistake are absolute, that doesn't just give you a dopamine hit, it reinforces a profound sense of self-efficacy. It's a cognitive restructuring that says, I was once powerless, but now I command my own fate, even at the edge of the abyss.
There's this idea that sometimes gets summarized as talent needs trauma. This idea of
We do see that overcoming a moderate, manageable level of adversity can be very growth promoting as long as a person has enough support to process it. And when you look at studies of elite athletes, including Olympians, you frequently find a decisive negative life event in their past.
a crisis, a loss.
A significant loss, a systemic hardship that acted as a major turning point. The trauma response was then channeled into this relentless, perfectionistic drive to train and master their sport.
So it fuels the obsession.
It can foster highly driven, achievement-oriented traits. In some cases, that intensity can manifest as a kind of ruthlessness or an egoistical pursuit of goals, because that external success is what validates the internal sense of control they so desperately crave. The sport becomes the arena where a shattered self can be rebuilt piece by intense piece.
But the paradox here is huge.
Mhm.
This drive for mastery is powerful, but the physical danger is immense. And ironically, it can bring them right back to that initial state of trauma and vulnerability.
The paradoxical risk is stark. As we said, the fatality rates are high. But beyond the immediate risk of a mistake, we have to consider the chronic risks, especially in sports that involve high velocity or repeated impacts. We're talking about severe and repeated traumatic brain injuries, TBIs.
And a TBI is a serious threat because it directly damages the very system they're trying to regulate in the first place.
Precisely. We know TBIs cause long-term psychological consequences. They damage the delicate structures of the central nervous system, often leading to chronic anxiety, depression, and, in a horribly reinforcing cycle, new or worsened PTSD.
So the person seeking external control is risking further neurological damage that undermines their internal control even more.
It's a compulsion trap, using a system-damaging activity to try and stabilize a system that was already damaged by earlier stress.
And when does it cross the line into addiction?
It frequently spirals into a compulsion, especially when the activity is being used purely as an avoidance mechanism for negative emotions. When the need to train or climb or jump becomes compulsive, even when there are mounting negative consequences, we call this exercise addiction, or EA.
The sport is no longer about joy, it's about necessity.
It's an addictive, desperate need to achieve that dopamine equilibrium. And EA is highly comorbid with the very issues we've been discussing: depression, anxiety, eating disorders, ADHD, and a history of trauma. The athlete is just chasing the high to manage the internal pressure and emptiness caused by their allostatic load. The compulsion is a huge red flag that the activity is no longer adaptive, but compensatory and destructive.
So let's move to the data that actually confirms these connections. Because this isn't just theory, right? Researchers have found a very specific, statistically established chain reaction here.
That's the most critical insight. The relationship isn't direct. Trauma doesn't just tell you to go base jumping. Trauma creates an internal state that looks and feels a lot like ADHD, and that state is what drives the individual to seek out these high arousal environments.
Okay, so let's start with the baseline. What do we see when we compare athletes and non-athletes when it comes to this internal restlessness?
When researchers use self-assessment tools for ADHD symptoms, athletes, and particularly those in extreme sports, shows significantly higher overall ADHD symptoms than the general population.
Was that across the board or in specific areas?
It's particularly pronounced in the measures for hyperactivity and impulsivity, which aligns perfectly with the kinds of behaviors you'd need to manage a fast life strategy or that reward deficiency syndrome we talked about.
And what do the actual prevalence numbers say?
Well, the general population prevalence for ADHD is usually cited somewhere around 2.5% to, say, 7%. But in studies of elite athletes, you often see a prevalence of 7 to 8%.
So slightly higher.
Slightly higher, but that's likely a significant underestimate. Because physical activity itself, even moderate activity, is a powerful natural intervention for ADHD symptoms. So the very act of successfully engaging in these sports might be masking the true severity of their underlying symptoms.
They're successfully self-medicating, so they might not look as symptomatic on a checklist.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the modeling that confirmed the mediation. This is really the heart of the research. How did they definitively connect the dots from trauma to extreme sports?
Right, the chain of events.
They used a type of analysis called path analysis to test the flow of influence. And the results were really conclusive. They found that childhood maltreatment and pre-existing PTSD strongly predict or increase the severity of ADHD symptoms.
Okay, so step one is trauma leads to more severe ADHD symptoms.
Yes. And then step two, the severity of those ADHD symptoms strongly influences the probability of that individual engaging in high-risk extreme sports.
So to put it simply, the formula is trauma creates an ADHD-like state of dysregulation, and that state then requires extreme stimulation to manage.
Precisely. The research confirms that ADHD symptom severity acts as the crucial mediator. It's the functional bridge between the initial chronic stress load and the eventual behavioral outcome of participating in high-risk sports.
It's a really compelling, evidence-based roadmap for understanding the psychological journey these individuals are on.
It is, and the data also illuminates some really important distinctions in how this plays out based on gender, which helps explain why we see so many more men in these high lethality extreme sports.
Okay, so what are the differences in terms of the psychological burden itself?
Well, generally speaking, female participants in these studies report a significantly higher overall psychological burden. They tend to report higher rates of childhood maltreatment, especially things like emotional neglect and sexual abuse.
And they also score higher on measures for PTSD and ADHD.
They do, compared to their male counterparts in the same study groups. And this really just mirrors broader public health statistics on trauma exposure.
So if women are carrying a heavier burden of trauma, why do we see more men externalizing that distress into taking these extreme risks?
This is a classic sociological distinction. Our coping strategies often align with traditional gender socialization. When under chronic distress, women are far more likely to internalize their symptoms.
So their distress manifests as things like depression or anxiety.
Exactly. Internalizing disorders, major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, or disordered eating behaviors. Men, on the other hand, are very strongly socialized to externalize their distress.
Because emotional vulnerability is often stigmatized for men.
It is. So externalizing behaviors, things like aggression, substance use, and significantly for this conversation, spectacular risk-taking become the sanctioned outlet. Extreme sports offer a mechanism for emotional regulation that society often validates as being masculine or courageous or adventurous.
So these sports can become a culturally acceptable release valve for intense internal emotions like undiagnosed depression or anxiety that men might struggle to talk about.
That is the core insight. The activity provides a powerful, highly kinetic way for them to express that inner pressure and get some emotional discharge. And that dynamic helps explain why the participation rate in high lethality extreme sports is so disproportionately male. It's an adaptive, if high-risk, coping mechanism that gets a kind of implicit social validation.
Okay, so we have spent a lot of time defining the risks and the underlying burden here. But I think it's important that the takeaway isn't that all extreme sport is just pathology.
Oh, absolutely not.
Physical activity itself, when it's managed correctly, is an incredibly powerful therapeutic tool. It's capable of actually counteracting some of the damage done by that chronic stress.
It is. Sport, especially when it's practiced moderately and consistently, is globally recognized as a powerful preventative factor and a supportive intervention for mental health. It can act directly to help undo that biological embedding we talked about. It helps reduce oxidative stress and that chronic low-grade inflammation.
So let's get specific. What are the neurological mechanisms? How does moderate activity help with ADHD symptoms and the damage from trauma?
Well, regular physical activity significantly improves the very cognitive functions that are impaired by trauma.
Things like focus and decision-making.
Precisely. Moderate exercise enhances attention, memory, and executive control. It helps stabilize critical brain structures, especially by strengthening that compromised prefrontal cortex.
Which improves impulse control.
It does. And crucially, it effectively regulates the key neurotransmitters we desperately need, dopamine and norepinephrine.
So if the root of the compulsion is a dopamine deficiency, then moderate physical activity really does sound like a non-pharmacological miracle drug.
It functions as a highly targeted intervention by stabilizing the dopamine and norepinephrine systems and by facilitating a sustained, regulated release rather than that addictive spike.
Hmm.
Moderate movement directly addresses the core symptoms of ADHD and that internal restlessness of reward deficiency syndrome. A short aerobic workout can promote a sustainable, positive neurochemical profile.
And this is why, generally, people who engage in moderate sport show a lower prevalence of psychological illnesses.
Exactly. The activity itself isn't the problem. It's the compulsion and the extreme intensity that are the variables that can turn it toxic. The data confirms this. Athletes who are actively engaged in moderate exercise actually show significantly fewer self-reported ADHD symptoms.
Which suggests the activity, when it's balanced, is actively therapeutic.
Yeah.
It's offering real symptom relief by regulating the central nervous system.
Yes. So the goal is to maximize that regulation while minimizing the existential risk.
So for the person who is drawn to these high arousal activities, the challenge really becomes one of self-awareness. It's about maximizing the proven benefits like the self-regulation and resilience while actively minimizing the catastrophic risks like severe injury or that spiral into exercise addiction.
A conscious approach is absolutely paramount. Athletes need to develop a real vigilance in monitoring themselves for the signs of overload or burnout or that shift toward compulsion.
And what's the key question they should be asking themselves?
Is this activity necessary for me to manage a negative emotion, or am I engaging in it because I genuinely enjoy the challenge in the process? If it feels necessary, non-negotiable, despite negative consequences, that is a critical red flag. It indicates compensatory, addictive behavior.
Are there alternative, lower-risk paths that can offer that same kind of arousal management without the life-or-death stakes?
There are low-intensity but highly focused self-regulation techniques are invaluable here. Things like mindfulness practices, yoga, tai chi.
Things that aren't about getting a massive dopamine spike.
Exactly. They're about gently stabilizing the system over time. These methods improve concentration, they enhance self-awareness, and they stabilize the dopamine system without the intense physical stressors or the risk of TBI you get in extreme sports. They build the fundamental self-regulation skills you need to manage a nervous system that's been wired for chaos.
So when we put all these pieces together, what does this all mean? I think it means we really have to stop looking at extreme risk takers as just adrenaline junkies.
We absolutely must retire that simplistic label. For so many individuals in these fields, their high-risk activity is a deeply personal, often unconscious attempt to self-regulate a nervous system that has been fundamentally altered by chronic stress or trauma. It is the ultimate expression of their allostatic load, and it's a search for competence in a world where vulnerability once reigned supreme.
And understanding that motivation is essential, not just for the athletes, but for the clinicians and coaches trying to help them.
It is. It's about promoting genuinely healthier coping mechanisms and maximizing the incredible therapeutic benefits that activity can offer.
We have completed a deeply illuminating dive today. We've traced this incredibly complex pathway, all the way from chronic stress and early trauma through the neurological changes that look like ADHD and reward deficiency syndrome, and culminating in this pursuit of high-risk environments is a profound form of self-medication and a search for mastery.
The complexity of these connections really just underscores how intrinsically linked our psychological experiences are with our biological machinery, the severity of psychological symptoms. Whether it's ADHD, PTSD, depression, it's not just a static checklist diagnosis. It is often a direct physiological reflection of a person's total allostatic load. It's a snapshot of the functional state of their core stress systems.
And that raises a fascinating and, I think, critical question about the future of how we diagnose and treat these things.
Indeed. And it leads me to this provocative thought for you to consider. If psychological distress is so fundamentally linked to physiological overload and HPA axis dysregulation, could incorporating objective biological markers provide a better way forward?
What kind of markers are you thinking of?
Imagine using detailed, multi-point cortisol profiles measured across a full day, or tracking specific neuroinflammatory markers in the blood. Could we move beyond behavioral checklists to track the true, invisible allostatic load directly? And if we could we intervene much, much earlier before the behavioral symptoms drive someone toward life-threatening extremes?
The connections are clear, the details are fascinating, and the implications for how we understand human behavior and human resilience are immense. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.